We're going to start chapter 5 by talking about the anatomy and physiology of the respiratory system. Some of you may recall this from previous classes that you've taken. We're just going to briefly go over it. There seem to be a lot of lectures in the respiratory system, but I divided it up into small chunks. So hopefully that'll make it easier. So this lecture, we're just going to talk about the general pulmonary anatomy and physiology. And so the respiratory system or the pulmonary system is a vital body system that works together with the cardiovascular system to deliver oxygen and remove carbon dioxide from the body. So those are two very important things. Oxygen is necessary for cellular metabolism and healing. I always say oxygen equals healing. Carbon dioxide is a waste product of metabolism, but it's also a big part of maintaining the acid-base balance in our body. So carbon dioxide dissolved in water is produced by cells. So if you burn carbohydrates in oxygen, or you get carbon dioxide and water and energy in the form of ATP. So we're always producing carbon dioxide dissolved in water, and that is part of our acid-base metabolism. So the respiratory system, if you recall, there's the upper respiratory tract, which is above the vocal folds, includes the nose and mouth, the paranasal sinuses, the pharynx, and the larynx. And we have normal flora bacteria that live in our upper respiratory tract. Part of the normal flora's job is to take up space so other bacteria and other things can't get in. The lower respiratory tract is everything below the vocal folds, and the lower respiratory tract is supposed to be sterile. No bacteria live there. If they get there, that's bad. We don't want that. So it includes the trachea, the bronchi, the bronchioles, and the alveoli, which is where the actual oxygen exchange happens. So you might recall from kinesiology when we talked about ventilation, we talked about the kinesiology of ventilation, the muscles involved. So there are really kind of two parts to breathing. There's ventilation, which is the mechanical part of the air going in and out, inspiration and expiration. But then respiration is the actual exchange of gases. So with ventilation, it's the process of inspiration and expiration, and it's accomplished by a combination of muscle activity and pressure gradients. So when the diaphragm contracts, it pulls downward, and airflow always moves from high pressure to low pressure. So when the diaphragm moves downward, it expands the thoracic cavity, decreasing the pressure, and the pressure becomes less than the atmospheric pressure of air outside our body, and the air rushes in, that's exactly what we want to happen. So the gases always flow, it's Boyle's law, from area of greater pressure to an area of lower pressure. And so by increasing the size of the thoracic cavity, we create an area of lower pressure for the air to flow into. When the diaphragm relaxes, it goes up, and it decreases the size of the thoracic cavity, creating an area of higher pressure, and the air moves out. That's how it's supposed to work. So the air moves out into the out of the lungs into the atmosphere. And the pressure in the alveoli is really important because we got to keep those babies open all the time. We'll talk more about that. So our ventilation is controlled by breathing centers in the brainstem, in the medulla and the pons. Chemoreceptors detect changes in carbon dioxide level, hydrogen ion, and oxygen levels in the blood and cerebral spinal fluid, and the central chemoreceptors are located in the medulla. We also have peripheral chemoreceptors located in the carotid bodies. And so when those chemoreceptors detect changes in the level, they stimulate the muscle contractions that are going to increase or decrease the pressure and cause inspiration and expiration. Kind of cool, right? So normally, we there's increase the chemoreceptors detect an increased level of CO2. And when we say PCO2, it's the partial pressure of CO2 in the blood and cerebrospinal fluid, and that stimulates the central chemoreceptors, which stimulates the inspiratory muscles, which increases the respiration rate, which removes more CO2 from the body. So you get decreased partial pressure of CO2 and decreased chemoreceptor stimulation, which slows the respirations, causing us to retain more CO2 and making the whole thing happen over again. Isn't that lovely? So the main thing that usually stimulates breathing when you have normal physiology going on is the increase in CO2, and that's called the hypercapnic drive. When somebody has pulmonary disease, we don't always that doesn't work the same way. So hypercapnia is when the carbon dioxide levels in the blood increase, and carbon dioxide easily diffuses into the cerebrospinal fluid. It lowers the pH and it stimulates the respiratory center. So you get increased depth and rate of respirations, sometimes called hyperventilation. If you get too much carbon dioxide buildup without breathing it out, it can cause respiratory acidosis, which causes nervous system depression. So if you have something that's making it difficult for you to breathe out, that can cause problems. So one of the things that can make it difficult for you to breathe out is any obstructive pulmonary disease, and we'll talk about those. Or if your breathing centers are depressed because you took too many narcotic pain medications or something, it decreases your breathing level and it causes respiratory acidosis. So when people die of an opioid overdose, they die of respiratory acidosis. That's what really happens. Hypoxemia is a marked decrease in oxygen in the blood. The chemoreceptors respond to that. And people with chronic lung disease, the hypercapnic drive doesn't usually work because they have trouble breathing out if it's an obstructive disease. And so they move to the hypoxic drive. So lower blood levels of oxygen stimulate the breathing centers in the medulla. So hypocapnia is low carbon dioxide concentration in the blood, so a low partial pressure of carbon dioxide, and it may be caused by hyperventilation. So you know the old thing where someone's hyperventilating, you put a paper bag over their mouth, keep it keeps in the CO2 that they're breathing out. They breathe it back in with the paper bag. So the paper bag thing really does work. When you are excessive, you are expiring excessive amounts of carbon dioxide, and that causes respiratory alkalosis, where your body systems are more alkaline because you're breathing out all your CO2. So it's interesting how that works. And we'll talk more about the hypoxic drive when we talk about obstructive pulmonary disease. So the gas exchange is actual respiration, where we're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide in the alveoli. So the flow of gases between the alveolar air and the blood is external respiration. The gas exchange depends on the relative concentrations, partial pressures of the gases. So the partial pressure of oxygen is PO2 and the partial pressure of carbon dioxide is PCO2. So each Dalton's law is another one of those gas laws. Each gas in a mixture moves along its partial pressure gradient independent of other gases. So if you have less oxygen, the oxygen's going to move to where there's less oxygen, and the carbon dioxide is going to move to where there's less carbon dioxide. And all those gas laws work together to make things actually work, which is nice when they do that. So the whole idea is we want to get oxygen in our bloodstream so it can get to the cells. And then when the cells take up oxygen, that's internal respiration. So just to reiterate, ventilation is the actual mechanical act of sucking the air in and blowing it out. And respiration is the exchange of the actual gases, oxygen and CO2. So when we talk about hypoxemia, anything with emia on it is blood. And so if you have hypoxemia, it's low oxygen in your blood. Hypoxia, on the other hand, is low oxygen in your tissues. So two different things similarly related. And we'll talk about those as symptoms of respiratory disease. So oxygen About 1% of it is dissolved in plasma, but most of it is reversibly bound to hemoglobin in our lovely red blood cells, our lovely erythrocytes. So the binding and release of oxygen to hemoglobin depend on the partial pressure of oxygen, the partial pressure of CO2, the temperature, and your plasma pH. So really, in order to function normally, our pH has to be in a pretty small range, 7.35 to 7.45, um, pretty small range. So carbon dioxide, it's the waste from our cellular metabolism, and about 7% of it is dissolved in plasma, and about 20% of it is reversibly bound to hemoglobin. And most of it diffuses into red blood cells rather than being bound to hemoglobin. Some of it's floating around in the plasma, some of it diffused into red blood cells, and some of it is reversibly bound to hemoglobin, where it can travel back to the alveoli to get out of the body. So we talk about all these different lung volumes and lung capacities. So a volume is one measure, and a capacity is a combination of volumes. So think of it that way. So our total lung capacity is the total amount of all the different volumes of air added up together. So we have a certain volume that's called the residual volume. Our lungs are never completely empty. And that's probably good because we want to keep our alveoli open. So our residual volume is sitting there. And then we have, if you take a really big breath in, the volume of air above the normal tidal volume is the inspiratory reserve volume. So the tidal volume is the small amount that we're breathing in and out, in and out, in and out, with our normal relaxed inspiration and expiration. So if you take that really big breath in above the normal tidal volume, that's the inspiratory reserve volume. And that is part of the inspiratory capacity. So the tidal volume plus the inspiratory reserve volume add up to the inspiratory capacity. If you exhale after your normal expiration phase of tidal volume, it's the expiratory reserve volume. So if you've ever had a breathing test where they make you breathe into the spirometer and you have to blow out, blow out, blow out as much as you can, that's your expiratory reserve volume. So as long as our alveoli are open and we're alive, there's a small amount of residual volume that stays in the lungs, so they don't deflate completely. If they do, the alveoli get stuck shut. That's called atelectasis. And it's like the produce bags at the grocery store. You can't get them open, they're kind of stuck together. You don't want that to happen to your alveoli. So our vital capacity includes the inspiratory capacity and the expiratory reserve volume, which means a maximal inspiration plus a maximal expiration. That's your vital capacity. If you add the reserve volume to the vital capacity, that adds up to the total lung capacity. So this chart is in the book. It's a good thing to know. It's a good thing to know the definition of those. I have seen them show up in board exam questions, so you should kind of know how that works, what each of those volumes and capacities stand for.